Okay. All right. So the big thing here is the attending case, and it's a classic one. Richard Cook and I saw this when we started studying expertise in anesthesia 30 years ago, sitting in on the discussions of how things didn't always go well. And you start running through the cases and start understanding why things usually go well, which is an important thing in the field, understanding not how it went wrong, but using that to go look for why it usually goes right, and only every once in a while it goes wrong. Why? Because there is some source of graceful extensibility keeping things on track, or steering and navigating a variety of constraints, gaps, and difficulties, seizing opportunities. That adaptive capacity that's normally making the system work is hiding the fact that the plans, the model behind the plans, how the plan is embodied in automation and a variety of other forms, procedures, and policies is not as complete, coherent, and thorough, matching the world as the people who develop and deploy it think, right? So there are these otherwise hidden sources of resilience, and we will, as we go through the slides a little later, before we do the next exercise, remind everybody that the law of fluency, there are several empirical generalizations that come out. Now we're going to be setting up foundational statements. So first principles, the world works this way, has to work this way, it only works this way. You can't really relax those. You can hide from them a little bit, but you can't completely hide from them. Right? Finite resources and continuous change, you can't hide from, right? You can play hide and seek a little bit, but it will always find you. Finite resources and continuous change will find you and burn you if you aren't careful, right? So the law of fluency for your glossary. I mentioned it last time, I mentioned it again. So that's something you're going to look for and highlight as you build up and extend your glossary. So our attending case is the classic one. Right, a critical role, right, recognizes the potential for trouble ahead, recognizes the potential for that to create a bottleneck. In other words, when you need to be able to intervene because something's starting to spin out of control, you first have to get access or get some mechanism to act. By the time you get the mechanism to act, things have gotten further out of control. The patient's condition is deteriorated further. If it's deteriorated further, the pressure to do something goes up. The difficulty of doing something to get the physiology back in control goes up. Meanwhile, you're falling behind, you're falling behind, you're falling behind. And as we'll run through in the slides, this is the failure mode. He's trying to avoid the risk of decompensation. Right? And we'll get in and define decompensation for you today. Illustrate it and run through it and chart it. And it will be exactly what he's avoiding in this case. Now, it's nice, right? We're talking about potential possibilities, so we're going to get into frequency and surprise. What's surprise? And it's the surprise about surprise, it's not about frequency. Right? Now, the people who want to use surprise, define it as a probability or a frequency interpretation, also usually do it wrong. Right? But it's not enough to update your frequency approach to surprise. You actually have to think of it as model surprise, because models have limits. Why? Because there's finite resources and the world keeps changing. So even if you were right, it won't stay that way, because other parts of the network will adapt to your success. Right? You're going to hear that over and over and over again. Anticipation is in this. They're sacrificing something. What's interesting in this case is, what does the attending sacrifice? What does the attending sacrifice? Yeah. Yeah?
His ability to create a more lean environment.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's right. Well, who and how is it less lean? Who has to do the extra effort? The resident, right? So why does the resident have to do it? Under the thumb of the attending, right? He's the servant, he's the staff of the attending. What's the unit? Right? In this case, there's a unit of adaptive behavior. What's the unit of adaptive behavior? You could define it as the attending, because that's the source of the judgment. But if you look at it in terms of not only the judgment to do this, but also the ability to carry it out, what's the unit? The team. Right? So here's a case where you could compose your adaptive unit as the team, the anesthesia team. It's not the surgical team, right? So we're not talking about it as the OR as the unit of adaptive behavior. We're breaking it down and saying, oh, over here, in fact, actually notice in this case, what's the relationship between the surgical team and the anesthesia team?
More preparatory with the anesthesia. They don't really communicate that much unless the patient's ready for it.
Yeah, well, what's said in the case? It says right in the case, right? The surgical fellow says the course of surgery will be short, there'll be little fluid loss or blood loss, everything will be smooth and straightforward, right? And what does the attending say? I don't trust what their plan, right? So there's a difference between the perspective. This will become more and more important. You're going to see this over and over again. Perspective turns out to be a fundamental parameter in this, right? The surgical team has a different perspective, and they're focused on how this could be a textbook case, right in the competence envelope, right there, right, nice and smooth and sweet, right? The anesthesiologist, though, is supposed to manage trouble. They have a different perspective. If trouble happens, they have to take care of the cardiovascular physiology. Right? So if there's a collapse in blood pressure or heart rate or something, they have to intervene. It's their responsibility. The surgical responsibility is to do the surgery, right? And here's the plan for it, and hopefully and they will tend to be overconfident, right, that they can be on plan, that the plan will be smoother and simpler and more straightforward than it really might be, and that they can stay on it and the surprises won't happen. Dragons won't show up at the boundaries, right? So the surgeon, who's implicit, we don't really describe them except for them to say, here's a plan. But we can go back and infer in this little case, all right, that they are right there in the middle of the competence envelope, and their perspective on themselves as an adaptive unit is overconfident and miscalibrated. Overconfident, the competence envelope is bigger than it is. Right? Miscalibrated, they think, right, they underestimate the possibility of surprises occurring. The anesthesiologist is there to manage trouble, right? We will call them snafu catchers. He is there as a snafu catcher and the team. Snafu, right? Situation normal, all fucked up. That's the coinage from the Americans in World War II. These were the guys who were winning. And the normal state of affairs was all effed up, right? And what are we? Finite resources and continuous change reminds us that the normal state of affairs of systems is gaps and holes and rifts and incoherencies. Things are not going to align as perfectly as the people who think the plan is the way it is, right? So if you just view the world through the plan, what was that picture I put up, right? There's the plan. The letters made the window, and you look out, and it's always springtime. Everything's always in bloom, right? Everything's going to be short with little blood loss, right? Everything's going to be highly successful. And what's the reality? The anesthesiologist is the dragon tamer, right? They're there to catch the snafus, the gaps, the inconsistencies, the surprises that are underestimated. So a lot of what I talked about is all captured, and we can lay out in this. So they invest, rather than think of it, and we like the word sacrifice for a bunch of reasons, but you can also simply think of it as they're investing their resources. So the anesthesia team is investing their resources, or the attending is investing the resident's resources, because they have, right, the authority arises at the attending level. They control their resources. Gee, I wonder if there's something different over here about this. Let's see what you have here. So what's the safety manager doing? So it's the same thing, right? At what? What's different about it? What? Location, yeah. What's another word for it? Right? We said these are multi-role, multi-echelon, right? Or level, or layer, or scale, scope. Right? You can say scope, right? So they're dealing with a broader scope of surgeries, of time, right? Right? So I'm not dealing with this patient with this surgery right now. I'm dealing with a class of surgeries over a much longer period of time. I'm dealing, again, though, with a possibility of trouble. And guess what? So my outpatient surgery, like a cosmetic surgery place, is based on the idea that the plan will be short and sweet, no trouble. Right? Short and sweet, no trouble. Again, same thing, different scale. So the first thing we're illustrating is the stuff we talk about operates at different scales, different scopes, different levels. And in both cases, we have what we showed you with the dragon diagrams. Right? We've got one part of the system pushing, right, on the competence envelope going, thinking they're far from saturation, far from the boundaries, going, everything's great, right? And they're taking advantage of a variety of things. So our faster, better, cheaper pressure, and they're looking better and better and better, right? We can bring in more patients, we can turn them around more quickly, we don't have to have as expensive facilities, we don't need as much staff, we don't need as much equipment. Anybody starting to get worried about dragons at the boundaries? I need less staff, I need less expertise, I need less equipment, right? I'm planning it short, I've got a busy schedule, right? All of a sudden you start going, oh, wait a minute, early signs of trouble? That's going to disrupt the schedule if I delay this, right? If I take longer than planned for, what's going to happen to our revenue stream? We were counting on 5 surgeries a day, every day to make money. Keep the place open. See how the pressures might start to build? And now what we have, as a safety manager, they're supposed to, right, anticipate trouble, supposed to say what happens out there, supposed to recalibrate the people who are miscalibrated about the possibilities of surprise and who are overconfident that they can handle them, right? Because they're making an assumption that, hey, anybody can handle a crisis, right? And what would we look at and go, that is probably not a good assumption. The boundary on your competence envelope is much shorter. The capacity to exhibit graceful extensibility at the boundaries is much less than they think. So that's it, right? So we're going to come back and invest resources again, right? The resources are, I have to get the team together to go through the training. I have to have the simulator. I have to have the instructors who put this together and stage it. It takes money, right, to put all that together. It takes a facility. So when 20 years ago, did most places have those training centers in healthcare? No. Today, how many are in town? OSU has one. Riverside has one. Anybody else? Children's have one? Children's has one, right? There's at least 3. There's probably more in this town, right? What? I don't know if they do or don't. It's a smaller system. But I'm just saying, as I know, Riverside, OSU, and Children's has one. So you can go now and practice. But so they made that investment. But to practice means you've got to take people out of productive activity and send them off to practice. How often do you think doctors practice crisis training? Right? When I started working with the hospitals, it was 0. Right? The only time they practiced crises was when they were in one. So they were all real. Today, how many times do they practice a simulated crisis? If we took the average of all the population of physicians and nurses who would be involved in these things, how many do you think they get to practice? 10? Anybody want to start with 10? 5? Maybe they practice 5 to get good? You know, like 10? 5? 3? How about 3? Do you think they practice it 3 times? How about once? Right? Most of them, if you go over there, have done it once. Right? So what are you investing in, and the trade-off there, that now as you go up in scale, the resource investment starts to become more difficult to justify in the long term. Back to this column. All right. Also notice there you are, given that you are doing outpatient surgery, right, your experience with dragons has to go down, right? Even though there may be surprises, the fact, right, there's now spread. They're not just one anesthesiology team in surgery, right, or one team in an emergency room, but now you're spreading it out over a bunch of different episodes. So what's the odds that any one surgical team doing outpatient, such as cosmetic surgery, is going to experience a serious surprise and get partway into a crisis, right? As a group, right, the odds are low. Otherwise, we wouldn't do outpatient cosmetic surgery, right? But are the odds of you as a group, are there odds that you're going to experience a surprise? What's the probability that you as a group, if you were all outpatient cosmetic surgeons, which would all mean you were pretty wealthy and you wouldn't be here, what do you think, what's the odds that you have, that this group of outpatient surgeons has experienced a surprise? 50%, 75%, 80%? Come on, give me a number. What number you want? Is it a probability? No, it's not a probability, right? And guarantee, it's a number, right? I don't care how reliable you are, as you increase the frequency of doing it over a wider scope, right? So this whole facility or this set of facilities this hospital runs, but it isn't a probability anymore, it's a certainty because you're doing a bigger time and space averaging window, right? A bigger time and space averaging window, which means it's not a probability, it's a certainty. The odds of you experiencing it as a cosmetic surgeon aren't that high. The odds of one of you experiencing it aren't odds anymore, right? That's an important point. All right, so at this scale, being able to anticipate is harder. Being able to intervene and get the extra resources takes more resources because it's at the wider scale. There are more parties, more stakeholders in that decision. In the other case, the only stakeholder directly in the decision, the only other authority, right? There isn't another authority. The attending has that within their scope of responsibility and in their range of scope of authority and their scope of autonomy. Right? They have the resources. The resident can go do it to prepare for the possibility of trouble ahead. So the contrast, we have group, and we have a bigger unit, which connects to more units in the neighborhood in order to do the crisis management training. So don't think of it as individual group, right? Think of it as, in one case, the unit has fewer interdependencies on making the investment. In the larger scale case, going up in scale means you have to pay attention to more interdependencies to other units at other levels, right? That's what we really want to focus on. I made the point, how do you keep this up to date? The indicator being how often does a surgeon or surgical team go through the crisis training. So is this up to date? Are the scenarios up to date? Are they capturing the latest risks or the latest information we have on how crises might appear? What's good in terms of teamwork in handling a crisis? Are we keeping these up to date, or do they become stale? Right? Pilots go through regular crisis training called crew resource management every year. Right? One of the judgments we made in some of the reviews we've made of international commercial aviation is that our team training in non-normal situations has gone stale. Everybody likes it, it's wonderful, but when we actually look, have they improved their teamwork in handling abnormal situations? The answer was no. Right? A prestigious committee looked at this 2013, right, and found out, whoops, our team training got stale. We were making an investment on the surface, but the substance was getting lost over time. Why? Because everything was going great. We had improved, right? And so we started to lose it, went stale. That's going to come back and remind us as we move further in class next week. Yes, here we go. Higher level of direct authority to implement the resilient strategy. Absolutely. They have to deal with different situations. It's easier. One thing, it's easier to rationalize away the need for crisis training when you're dealing with the broad thing. And we see this all the time. It won't happen to me. Or when something happens, I'm not surprised it happened to them. They're not as careful as we are. Right? Well, guess what? Being careful isn't good enough. In the adaptive universe, being careful, when somebody says they're being careful, or more careful than the others, or those people were careless, that's why they got into trouble. Right? What does that say? It says, guaranteed you're overconfident and miscalibrated. You don't know where the boundary is, and you don't know what kinds of dragons you're dealing with. So when it comes time to tame them, you're not likely to do very well. So there's an ambiguity on the effectiveness of the intervention. That's what this one is getting at. Be careful with the word fail-safe. But there's a different directness of the intervention. The intervention over here is tailored directly to a specific problem. right? Or a class of problems where the remedy is I'm going to need to put medicines or fluids or blood in. And when I need to do it, I don't know what I'm going to need to do or how much I'm going to need to do, but when I need to do it, I need to do it quickly. So I'm establishing a very specific action potential, right? This gets back to your question about it isn't just robustness. And we can't get to this till we get a little further on as to the real way to answer your question. I have a very specific and important empirical way for you to test the answer to that question, because you can't decide it automatically in advance, robustness versus resilience, right? But there's a way to do that, but we have to get to some stuff before we get there. So you'll remind me, I'm sure. So here it's much more definitive, and you can see the value of the intervention. You can talk to other people who know the field, and you can assess, okay, what does it mean to get that potential for action? The readiness to respond is much more specific. Here, the readiness to respond is more amorphous. It's more diffuse. It's easier to say the crisis training is not that valuable, or the only crisis training we can afford isn't really going to be that effective anyway. And so there's more room for discounting. And we'll see that in this miscalibration and mismodeling of these relationships, discounting comes in. All right, sustain. In sample 1, a counterpressure to efficiency is needed in order to reduce brittleness. Yep, that's what these things are about, right? If you just pursue faster, better, cheaper, and you never make investments at responding near the boundaries, you will be more brittle than you like, right? We're going to come back over and over again to net adaptive value. And net adaptive value is a pretty interesting phrase, and we're going to decompose and play with that some more as we move forward. Right? There's finite resources, and that's particularly important in sample 2, right? It's finite resources. So over time, what's going to happen in the organization? They're going to not have events, right? And when they don't have events, they're going to say, and I'm under economic pressure, or I'm under pressure to be more productive. They're going to say, why am I spending time? Why am I going off to do a simulated case when I can do real cases and, right, help people, right, generate revenue? I'm helping people, generating revenue. Why am I going off and doing this? So it becomes very difficult to sustain it. And how does the safety manager work with the other stakeholders in the neighborhood of the network in order to sustain the investment? Oh, wait. Let's say there is a crisis. You do the crisis management training, you have a crisis, they were trained to deal with the crisis, they deal with the crisis, okay. What is everybody's reaction? What? The training was a success, we don't need it anymore. We're all trained up. Right? Maybe the new people need it, but then we don't need our dedicated center, or we don't need to staff it, but then I have to other hospitals, and we don't like that, right? They're really going to do that. So do this and it works. It's very easy then for people to say it's worked and we're done, right? Because in our mentality, an issue is a problem that has a solution, and when it's solved, it's over. The game is over. The fat lady has sung, as they say. In the adaptive universe, there are no fat ladies singing. None. It keeps going. Right? Because your successes, your adaptations, trigger adaptations from other parts of the system. And so they come back and go, this was great. You're a brilliant safety manager. You made an investment. We appreciate your investment. Everybody's trained up. Boom. Cut the program because it worked. And that's why, one of the reasons why we go around in different settings. An example of a company, one of our alumni from this learning about resilience engineering, went off and got a job, became a manager, and dealing with all this stuff. And of course, what did they get upper management to practice crisis decision making? Once. And they were all patted themselves on the back. We're good now. We know what to do. You're like, not all crises are the same. There's a lot of different components to this, and what worked may not be effective over the long haul if you don't reinforce it. Anybody notice basketball players after a layoff, or critical injury to a couple key players, and they come back and watch the first game when they come back? These are the best athletes in the world doing something they've done for the skill sets they've done since they were little kids, right? They're incredibly good at it, and when they don't practice for a while as a team, they look terrible. They're awful, right? So we go back and say, if you want to have good teamwork, if you want to behave effectively when things are changing and potentially deteriorating or really deteriorating and you've got to respond effectively, it turns out doing it once isn't enough. Why do they need a preseason? Why do they need to practice? These guys are the greatest athletes possible. And yet, if they don't practice the game, they don't play the game very well relative to the other teams in all of this. So the safety manager can easily get into a dilemma where where do they decide to put limited resources? And this is where we come back and say the safety manager has to have some resources to invest in building safety, building resilience, but what are the most important ones? Because they're not going to give me an unlimited budget, and they're not going to give me a budget that I can keep forever. So I need some resources, but I got to know which ones are effective and how will they make a difference in the world. So I have to keep planning and prioritizing where I make a difference if I'm the safety manager. They're operating at different echelons, and so these different processes play out. Okay, so we've covered enough for right now. We can pause this little piece. This was great. This is a nice little audio talk over to add to our website on this case. Everybody getting fun with it?